So I have three ideas on the way to an argument about what I think you need to do. So here's the first idea. Route striker. In 1846, about 2,000 miles from where we are right now, in Walden Pond, this man, Henry David Thoreau, wrote this. There are 1,000 hacking at the branches of evil to one who is striking at the root. Root striker. That's the first idea. Here's the second. Independence. I say that word, especially among lawyers, and people typically think of 1776. I don't mean the independence of 1776, the independence from Britain. I mean instead to think about the kind of independence that was increasingly on the minds of Americans around 1786, when most who knew anything about America thought America was going to be a failure. And it was going to be a failure because of a lack of independence within the democracies that had spread across the nation, a lack of independence and improper dependence that had developed within those democracies. Dependence, an obsessive focus of the framers and Jane Austen, dependence, which Thomas Jefferson referred to as begetting a subservience and venality, suffocating the germ of virtue, prepares fit tools for the designs of ambition. This is what government had become, and they sought non-dependent, independent governments that could find a right answer to the problems that the nation faced for the right reason. Their common aim were institutions, constitutions, against this improper dependence. But the key point to recognize here is that they sought protection against improper dependence by securing the proper dependence that government needed. So, for example, think about the independent judiciary. By independent judiciary, we don't mean a judiciary that gets to do whatever the hell they want. We don't mean a judiciary dependent upon politics and not dependent upon money. What we mean is a judiciary dependent upon the law. That proper dependence is what constitutes the independence of a judiciary, here and elsewhere. That's the second idea. Here's the third. I want you to think about trust. And think about the way trust is related to independence, or the way trust is related to the right kind of dependence existing within an institution or government. So here's an example to tease this thought out. Some of you might recognize this chemical. I wouldn't. This is bisphenol A, or otherwise known as BPA. This is a chemical which is increasingly in almost everything we touch, particularly plastics. It's a very high concentration in most of our bodies right now, leading many people to wonder, is it safe? Most of us think it must be safe. Why else would it be everywhere if it weren't safe? But in fact, the research about this is quite contested. But it is contested in an interesting way. If you distinguish between industry-funded research and independently funded research, and between studies that find BPA harmful and studies that find it not harmful, there's a predictable pattern here. 0% of the industry-funded research finds any problem with BPA. All of it finds BPA to be not harmful. But of the independently funded research, just about 14% finds it non-harmful, and 86% find it to be harmful, presenting this bipolar result that leads to all of you being less sure right now about whether BPA is safe than you were 2 minutes ago. Or think about cell phones. Are cell phones safe, these microwave emitting devices that you place right next to your brain? Well, 70% of us believe, of course, they must be safe. We have government agencies to think about problems like this, and we've had cell phones for more than 40 years. Someone must have figured this out, but again here, the research is contested, and it's contested in a particular way. If you distinguish between industry-funded research and independently funded research, once again, you find this bipolar pattern, which now leads you to be less sure about the safety of cell phones than you were a minute ago. The point is that confidence here is being eroded by the presence of money in the wrong place. Now, we wanted to study this to see how general it was, and we did a massive study of attitudes and simply set up hypotheticals where we mentioned the relationship between the output of the work, whether it was a doctor or a researcher or a politician, and money, as in incentives affecting their work. And what we found was the mere suggestion of a financial incentive significantly influenced participants' trust and confidence in the particular result. And indeed, the variations significantly influenced the participants' judgments of their own doctors, politicians, and consumers' goods, meaning when they heard about a corrupting influence in one context, they read back upon their own personal experiences and inferred the same kind of corruption. The point is not that money in general is corrupting. The point is that money perceived to be in the wrong place has a corrupting influence on people's attitudes about the institution or department of government so described. The lesson here is that to maintain confidence, to maintain trust in institutions that depend upon public trust, we need to secure the independence of those institutions by securing the proper dependence that we believe they should have. Okay, 3 ideas, here's the argument. I want you to think about trust with this institution, where the lack of trust is now profound. Gallup's latest poll found that 11% of the American public have confidence in the institution of Congress. Let's think about what 11% means. There were more people who had faith in King George III at the time of the Revolution than who have confidence in our Congress today. Now, why is it there is such a profound lack of trust? Well, here I'm going to engage a little bit of brainwashing to get you to see this in the way I want you to see it. Let's think about some examples. One that I spent many years thinking about. Copyright is the first. I became an activist around copyright on October 27, 1998, when the president signed into law a bill honoring this great American, Sonny Bono, the Sonny Bono Copyright Term Extension Act. This is a statute that extended the term of existing copyrights by 20 years. Now, the question that Congress was to consider as it passed this statute was whether such an extension of existing copyrights advanced the public good. Because after all, a copyright is designed to create incentives to create new work. At least if we live in a world governed by the physics of our universe, not Star Trek's universe, we know you can't affect incentives retrospectively. Not even the United States Congress can get George Gershwin to produce anything more. So it could not possibly be the case that extending the term of an existing copyright creates any more creative incentives. And so when we challenged this statute in the Supreme Court and got a bunch of economists to write a brief that tried to explain this to the Supreme Court justices, one liberal economist, this is the right-wing Milton Friedman, Nobel Prize-winning economist, said he would only join this brief if the word no-brainer was in it somewhere. So clear was it that you couldn't advance the public good by extending the terms of existing copyrights. But apparently there were no brains here when Congress unanimously passed this statute, sending it to the president for his signature. What we know there was an extraordinary amount of campaign money, $6.3 million given by the Disney Corporation to support this extension of copyrights that would benefit primarily these large copyright holders like Disney. Or here's another example. This is a picture of a 14-year-old kid. It's a picture of an epidemic which is sweeping our country. Since 1980, the number of children who are technically obese has tripled. For kids over the age of 2, 1/3 are now considered to be obese. Now, this epidemic has costs. One particular cost is in the context of type 2 diabetes, a kind of diabetes that used to afflict old people only. Now, in some communities, half of the new cases are cases from kids. The total cost is $147 billion in annual direct care costs. And that leads many people to wonder, why is it we've seen this dramatic change? Well, the easiest answer points to what we eat. There's a consensus that we eat too much of this stuff, not enough of this stuff, and not actually this stuff. It's more high fructose corn syrup that has increasingly become a staple of our diet. 40% of the products at your supermarket have high fructose corn syrup in it. And that leads some to wonder why have such a growth in this particular sweetener, a sweetener which just 25 years ago was nowhere on our diet? Well, the answer has something to do with the fact that sugar is relatively expensive compared to corn. And that leads free market fans to say, well, if this was the market demand, so be it. We just use a market to allocate to the highest valued use, and if this is the conclusion about the way sweeteners should be allocated, then this is how we should order our economy. But you can't move quite so quickly with this story. Sugar is expensive in the United States because of tariffs. About $1 billion in tariffs that give benefit to the 6 major sugar producers in the United States, costing the United States economy about $3 billion in inefficiencies, because sugar now costs between 2 and 3 times the price that it costs anywhere else in the world. And corn is so cheap because it's subsidized by our government. $74 billion over the last 15 years, leading some economists to say the cost of producing corn is actually negative. So you take these two facts, sugar being protected through tariffs, corn being subsidized, add them together, and you see the radical shift in the cost of foods. So vegetables between the period 1993 and 2003 increased in price by 17%, while the cost of a Big Mac went down by 5.4%, and the cost of a bottle of Coke went down by 35%. And there's also a radical shift in how food gets made. Many of you saw this fantastic film, Food Inc., which describes how, because corn is so cheap, we can afford to feed cattle corn, making these factory farms profitable. Of course, this is not so profitable for the poor cows, because their stomachs don't actually digest corn in a proper way. So they have to be fed tons of antibiotics to deal with the spread of infection that this way of feeding them produces, which then filters out plentiful amounts of superbugs that are resistant to our ability to deal with them. And if this were a film, I'd now cut to a 3-year-old who ate a hamburger and then died from some E. coli infection. All of this because corn is so cheap and sugar is so dear. Now, this leads some to say, what would explain such anti-free market silliness in the food policy of our government? The Republican Party never went to the polls saying that what we want to do is to protect sugar and subsidize corn, and neither did Democrats. This is not the principle of either party. So it's kind of hard to figure it out, but again, this is one thing we know. There is an endless amount of campaign cash supporting these two crazy policies. ADM spending millions of dollars to get support for corn, and the sugar manufacturers spending millions in elections to continue to get protection for sugar. And if it's because of that campaign money, we can say campaign money distorts markets, which distorts food production, which distorts our kids. Or here's another example. Think about Wall Street. We've just seen the economy go off the cliff, part product of the explosion in the financial sector. Why did we get to this place in the regulation of our financial sector? Well, this book by Simon Johnson and James Quack tells a very important story about a perverse mix that we had allowed to develop in our economy between too little government and too much government. So too little government, as in deregulation,